In my moments with you right now, I'm going to talk about the overall issue of what I believe the eighth principle that's being discussed by our denomination, what it is connected to with us as we develop as allies to us all, as family to us all. And in this part here at the beginning, we're going to talk about our hearts and our heads. You know, mind, body, spirit is connected, and how we could think about that a little bit as individuals. And then in the breakout, we'll actually discuss whatever's on your mind or whatever questions or concerns you have about it. What you see here is a copy of the book that I wrote after going through a lot of the thoughts that connect to this topic. And that's me. That's my website. If you want to just know more about what I do and what I'm connected to and the kind of consulting I do and all that, that's the place to find it. Just westcloudconsultingllc.com. Thanks to, there's a couple, I see a couple of FUCO, we say, First Unitarian Oakland members here. I haven't been able to look through the whole thing, but hi everybody and thanks for joining. Where we are right this minute is for me to talk a little bit about this topic in a way that I think will help our conversation later, where all of you will have a chance to say what you have on your mind and your heart. We use the term BIPOC these days. I cannot remember the origin, but the idea is that as we learn about the world, about our sister and brotherhood, our family in this earth, there's ways to speak that are more inclusive. And BIPOC, if you don't know, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, because if we have a tendency to talk about inclusion as a discussion about what's happening between people, say Blacks and whites, or something like that, and people of color is kind of, yeah, that's inclusive too, nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't quite take the whole range. So I didn't create that, but I know that I support the use of terms like that. And as we evolve into different ways of talking about things, we can make those shifts as they make sense. I'm old enough to remember the days when we said colored and not Black, or a Negro, or something that we don't do now. And I prefer that nobody does it actually, but it depends on what environment you grew up in and your family and neighborhood and so on, whether you know kind of how things have evolved. So that counts in what we're going to talk about today. The updated language is a way of showing respect and inclusion, just like most UU congregations that I know about are including those kinds of things that have to do with including the indigenous land that we're all standing on. And in Vince's tradition, and actually me else too, since they're cousins, they talk about the border across them. And what does that mean? It means they were here before there was a United States. They were on this side of that thing that we call the border now. So talking about issues like the ones that the eighth principle covers means understanding who are we referring to, who are the family members that are being left out. I wrote the book because I'm an Air Force brat, and it just so happens that we moved around so much that my African-American experience is not like even other members of my family. We lived overseas a lot and so on. So as these issues become more public, because remember the days when you didn't see these kinds of topics on TV the way you do now. And now that we're talking about it, a lot of things are coming out that some people have never heard of, or they had a different impression of, or whatever. And I tend to come down on a different place on a lot of things than some people do, especially if they expect that an African-American is going to refer to things or care about things in a certain way. There's a chapter in there on being UU. I became a UU in 1980. I come from a very, what we'd now call conservative family, but there's no narrow-mindedness. There's something that's been happening about using the word conservative, and automatically it means a closed mind. It doesn't have to be that. That doesn't mean I agree with a conservative angle on things necessarily, but it does not have to be hateful and narrow the way I think people are using it now. So between things like that and my background on my mom's side is New Jersey. On her matrilineal side, there are no slaves. And we know that because there's been land in the family since the early 1800s. And there's enough of a tract because it's Philadelphia, New Jersey, on that part of the evolution of the Underground Railroad, which my family's property was a part of. So that makes me different too. So I thought, you know what, every time I sit in a meeting, because I'm a social worker, or I'm dealing with a certain kind of immigrant or refugee group or something, and I have an angle that nobody else thinks of, I began to realize that that's why I think differently, because my upbringing is different than a lot of folks, regardless of race. Just, I've had an experience that a lot of other people have not on many levels. So I wrote the book, and because of my professional background working with refugees and immigrants in crises like Hurricane Katrina, yeah, I started saying, you know what, I think I just started to need to write this stuff down. So that's how the book got written. UU appealed to me. I was raised Baptist. It never did fit. I wrote about that in the book. When I was 12, I thought, this doesn't make sense to me, but there's no permission to say out loud and ask questions the way UUs are allowed to do. And then luckily in my early 20s, I met somebody who said, you know, I think you're a Unitarian. I said, what's that? And she referred me to a book, and I read it, and I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And then I immediately stepped into a situation where I was usually the only Black person. Now, what was interesting back in the day, though, is that I began to realize that there probably was a little more to it, but I didn't learn that until I happened upon a UUA event back in the 90s, where I met Black Unitarians for actually the first time. I think I'd met one before that. And then it evolved into organization participation and things like that. So my evolution on these issues feels like it's coming from many different places, including my own discovery of what it means to be a UU and not be white. One of the things that matters to me the most is our connection to spiritual justice. Spiritual grounded social justice, I'm sorry, and how all of that strengthens what should be good for the world and why we have responsibility for each other as humans. The thing that's interesting, though, is that as we talk about improving our activity as UUs along these lines, that is working with each other, how the process works for folks who are learning to be ministers, how different congregations deal with certain issues in their communities, all of that, it's very multi-leveled. So there's no way to talk about the whole thing right now, but I want to give you an idea of how to think about it in a way and how that might apply to you and how to walk the UU talk. That's what I call it. So I think, in my opinion, one problem that we have is that we have a tendency to say, I'm fine because I'm not the Klan. That's the way I put it. Well, the Klan is way out there. I'm not talking to them, and you're probably not talking to them either. And all the things that have grown out of people who think that way, then the junk that we see on the news every day and all of that, that's not who we are mostly. I've never met a UU that was exactly like that. I don't know about you, but there is a continuum, which is why you have this activity, this worksheet that I'm going to show you in a minute, to think about your own developmental process and improving how we develop as advocates and allies. One thing I think is real important to point out here is that this process applies to people of color as well as what would be European Americans. I don't use the word Caucasian. And you might not know that actually we started using that word Caucasian for white people in this country because the Supreme Court ruled against a Japanese-born person who was trying to be an American citizen. And he got the citizenship, and then there was a lawsuit and they took it away from him. There's a book that actually gets into all of that. They somehow started using that word, and then someone pointed out that actually has to do with the Caucasoids. So people who look like me who are from India are Caucasian. And that totally throws what we do in the United States in the trash. So I'm trying with words like that to talk about the developmental process of improving how we develop as advocates and allies with the continuum. So can you show that for us for just a sec? We're not going to work on it right now. I just want to show it to you.
Vera, can you show it, please?
I have to change the slides. Hang on a second.
No problem. You can just pop it in there. I can just say while you're doing that is I talk about this about like peeling an onion. Anybody love onions like I love onions? I love onions, whether they're fried or sauteed, and you put them in a sandwich and you get them crispy. But getting to that nice part is not easy, right? You cry, you sniff and all that because it's not simple or a one deal thing. After you peel it and you get down to the middle, and then you finally get to the place where it turns into something wonderful, there was a process to that. And this is the way I see our development with this issue, just like peeling an onion. The hardest part is, right before the end where you're crying and you're thinking, heck, I want to be done with this. What you see here is my continuum I developed in order to talk about this some more. I actually first did it, I think in 2006 or something, and it has developed a little bit over time. But basically, I have two continuums here that I want you to think about. We're going to look at this, and this will be the basis of the thing we do after I speak today. If you think about racism in the context of Unitarian Universalism, we're not talking about the Klan. Racist might be somebody's attitude that they express during a discussion at a meeting. Racist could be how somebody thinks about the neighborhood that's immediately around where the church is. It could be yuck, 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 but not the Klan probably. We're UUs. I would doubt that we'd have a UU that would be that bad, but racism goes all the way to people being murdered over who they are. That's why there's an arrow there. Ethnocentric just means anybody can be ethnocentric. They think, okay, you're fine as long as you're like me. That's simplistically what that means. And non-racist, I consider that not a neutral term because what non-racist means in my context means the enabler. That means you might not agree with the racism, whether it's against brown people or the new Asian violence that we're hearing more about. You don't like that, but you're not going to say anything because you don't want to get your own self in a bind. Anti-racist means you're doing something. The proactive and humble ally, that means you understand your white privilege. If you're a person of color, it means that you recognize that we are trained as the communities of color to be against other people of color. For example, African Americans will be anti-Mexican because supposedly they're stealing our resources. There are people who think that way. The people who think Asians are terrible and Asians hate everybody except white people, that's something that people of color could believe because they haven't had the kind of experience that tells them different. And the way our educational system tends to leave out the stuff that's controversial, so they sell the books. There's actually been a book written about that with research. So what being pro-positive is, as opposed to being really yucky, there's a lot in the middle, and it depends on how you grew up and with whom, and whether you're in a mixed family or not or whatever, how you understand those things. The person of color continuum talks about what we're taught to do as accommodating, because I can think of things that have to do with folks like Jews, or maybe even the Irish, who came here as the bottom of the shoe, and the point was to get yourself into the box that won't get you picked on anymore, which usually meant people threw away their names and their languages and their normal practices, depending on where they were from. With people of color, there's that same pressure too, of undoing how you do your hair, what you wear to work. There's all kinds of things that mean accommodating, because believing that the white standard is what you're supposed to do. That's operating from internalized oppression. The awakening might happen because of what's been happening on the news lately, you think, oh my goodness, I'd never realized that was going on for the Haitians. And I'm Black too, but I didn't know anything about Haitians. The affirming of self as a process, there's that arrow again, healing from that internalized depression, some of which came from us coping. Giving another example that actually you could call a white problem. If somebody grew up Jewish, and then they come to this country and say, I'm not going to be Jewish anymore. I don't want to get picked on. They marry somebody who's not Jewish. They don't tell anybody they're Jewish. And then their grandchildren don't realize grandma was Jewish. I know somebody that happens to, that has happened to. So yes, it's not really a straight line. Some of it applies to all kinds of ethnicities and races, but it is a process. And that's what I want us to understand. And the eighth principle gives us the opportunity to take up that extra step. That means, okay, I'm not just the non-racist white person who doesn't want to get in the middle. I am somebody who's willing to be the humble ally, whether it's writing a check or going further than that and being part of a nonprofit that helps a certain population or something like that. And for persons of color, it means not taking on the isms that we're taught from the white system and hammering other people of color for those reasons. So that's why it's a complicated thing to talk about. And I believe the eighth principle takes us an extra step toward making Unitarian Universalism exactly what I think it was probably always intended to be, but we're evolving as human beings. And we have to keep evolving. And some of that is peeling the onion, as I said. So walking the talk, my final points for you to think about, is addressing your background, your heritage, what you've been taught to believe, and the cultural coping mechanisms that I've spoken to a moment ago, like the Jewish example. That's a real person. I didn't make that up, that I know that that happened to. They were a grown adult before they found out their grandmother was Jewish. You have to look into your own history, and there might be secrets there. There's ugliness that's happened on all kinds of levels for different populations. People want to get past that and get away from it in a way that makes sense. But it doesn't help to try to skip over it, because it's actually like a lump under the rug that you're going to skip over. You're going to trip and fall down and hurt your knee. We can't do it that way. You have to address the way your church interacts with the populations of the community that are around you. And it depends on where you live, who that is. In the part of Colorado that I lived in since I was, I went to college in Colorado. So that's how I ended up there. I met my husband. His experience being born and raised there is different than mine, living all over the place and then moving to a place like Denver, where it has a certain kind of population mix, but it's nowhere near like the Bay Area. It isn't, it's probably never gonna be. And that's one of the reasons I love it here, because I feel like I see every part of my upbringing when I go to the grocery store even. It's neat. You need to recruit people to your services and events. What will that take? Who's in your immediate community? Who, it depends on what that mix is. Newer immigrants who happen not to be white may not understand things the way other people of color do. And if you don't know how long that family's been in this country, you don't know what their coping mechanism or what they've learned. One experience I can give you from my social work career is the, I think, it was Hmong community, the Southeast Asian folks near Vietnam that we got aware of. They moved here after the Vietnam War. I had one of the parents tell me that the white folks who ran the agency that helped them come to this country told them to keep their kids away from Black kids. And the reason he knew that was wrong is because he happened to work in the military when he was in Vietnam. And that's how he knew that wasn't right. But if somebody comes to this country, has never seen a Black person before, and all they've ever seen is what's in some of the movies that go internationally, or what somebody like that tells them, they're in the same bind that white people are in a certain way. So I don't know what your community is like, but you could have a big variety of things going on in your community that you don't know about. So you have to be involved in the community enough to know what is it going to take to invite those people and have them actually walk through the door. And I think the principles behind the eighth principle helps us take one extra step toward that, including walking our own talk to ourselves and financing our own UU activities nationally and locally. so that they really are open to everybody. And in the breakout, you should think about these issues as we self-assess. And with the honor of your presence here, I rest these thoughts with the spirit around us. And thank you. We will return to the conversation afterward.